friends like James in the coffee world, or people who specialize in tea or cocoa, often say to me, "Oh, you're so lucky because you work in the wine industry and you've got it all sorted out. You're able to really add a lot of premium to your product. Wow, isn't that amazing?" And yes, I think we have got a lot of really great stuff, but also I think we've been building a little bit of a house of cards, which is at a little bit of a tipping point, and that's what I'm going to sort of talk you through. So the idea is really to throw a lot of stuff out there. Some might land, some might not. You might think, "Oh, it's completely irrelevant," but I'd love to hear your thoughts. And also, we'll pepper the talk with the tasting in the middle. Okay, so some of the elements I think that we've been very good at doing is understanding terroir. Viticulture is about 10,000 years old. We've been making wine for thousands and thousands of years. We've had people, typically, for example, in Burgundy, who've spent hundreds of years, particularly the monks, who had, a lot of spare times on their hands, apart from, praying, did a lot of research on soil types. So for Burgundy, for example, is a great example as to where we've really understood what terroir and the impact of soil gives you. We've really developed a very sophisticated appellation system, whether you're in France and you call it the appellation d'origine contrôlée, similarly in Italy, similarly in Portugal or Spain, and now more and more into the New World, where we really relate, the origin to perhaps the type of wine that is going to be produced, and we've given that we've given it sort of legislations, and it's quite a sophisticated system that works, sort of. I think we've also nailed the customer experience, in a way that maybe other industries can learn from. I think we've been very good at, developing really beautiful multi-million-dollar facilities with tasting rooms, with restaurants, bars attached to it. Like big famous architects, they all want to get into, designing winery. That's kind of the, really nice to have on your portfolio. Then we've been so successful at creating such a glorified product in a way that now people invest, in wine. So, you can spend thousands of pounds on a case of wine. You never see it, you never touch it. I mean, I've done that. I've invested en primeur, made money. So you can literally buy a case of wine. You don't see it, a bit like an oil. You buy a barrel of oil on the tanker, and it gets moved from hand to hand at auction. This is how successful we've been with our industry, right? We've got a product. It's like, wow, so great that people will invest a lot of money and make money. But for me, where the system really collapses a little bit is that we've created, in fact, a really big illusion. We've moved wine, which was an agricultural product, something really beautiful that came out of, wanting to create booze and wanting to really, in fact, there are some theories that say that, we created agriculture not to feed ourselves, but we created agriculture to have easy access to grain and therefore to booze. So this is how prominent, wine and any other brews are to our, to our civilization. But what we've done with wine is we've taken this agricultural product, very simple, coming from farm, and we've put it into a lifestyle product. And to me, this is where we've gone wrong with the industry. So, when we talk about terroir, and this is a photo I took. It's not been photoshopped. I wouldn't be that good anyway to kind of create little grass on my photos. Here you're in the south of France, in an area called Banyuls. It's about a 600-hectare sort of AOC, geographical area. And obviously the grower I was visiting was the guy who farms on the left-hand side. And then he showed me this plot. In the wine industry, we talk about terroir, right? I mean, this is like terroir this, terroir that. When you farm like this vine, which is completely desolate, when you have zero life in the soil, there is no interaction between the plant and the surrounding soil. The plant is unable to actually captivate or use any of the minerals around it. So when you farm like this, which is over 90% of our industry, we're an industry which is very heavily polluted, you cannot talk about terroir because actually there's no uptake of that particular soil life, right? You can have example, and I know some of you are farmers, and I'm sure that resonates with you. We have examples when you visit a vineyard where a plant might suffer of chlorosis, which is an iron deficiency disease, and it's a yellowing of your leaf. And I've seen, vines sitting in iron-rich soils suffering from chlorosis. Okay, and why? It's because the soil is completely dead and there's no interaction. So the plant is completely cut off from the soil, the land around it. So we cannot talk about terroir when we talk about this and when this is how we farm. And yet terroir is like this big magical marketing word. Similarly, when you go to these big, fancy, expensive wineries, you don't really access the vineyard anymore. So you just go there and you go there to experience the wine and the wine tasting, but people don't really think about the farming anymore. Even though, initially we were an agricultural industry. We've elevated critics really to the status of gods. We've people like Robert Parker, even though his influence is slightly diminishing, but he was very big in the 80s and then in the 90s, to the extent where people in entire winemaking regions would change the way they farm and the way they make wine just so that he would like the wines. Because if he gave a 90+ point, you could double the price of your wine overnight. So suddenly you had these people who had so much influence because we took away the confidence from the consumer and said, you've got to listen to critics, you've got to listen to tasting notes, the ratings is what's all important. In his case, and in other cases, I visited places in Spain where like the way they make wine, it was just, gosh, you guys, they're not making wines to reflect the natural surroundings and the terroir. And I don't know how that applies to the coffee industry, maybe it doesn't, but people have started farming differently to get more riper notes, longer hanging times, more alcohol, riper flavors, changing the winemaking process, using maybe more new oak, more toast, just so that somebody on the other side of the Atlantic would say, yes, that's a 95-point wine, okay? And now his influence is a bit waning. People are moving away from these styles of wines, but you've got places all over the world that have actually changed the way they make wine or farm just to suit certain palates. Now what's happening to those people or to those wines? And then they have to reinvent themselves. So it's really important to sort of stick to what nature gives you rather than try and follow certain trends. This is quite a funny one because you've all heard of like the first growth, second growth classification system in Bordeaux. When this classification came about in 1855, chateaux like Latour, Margaux, Mouton Rothschild, they were not classified based on where they were or which terroir they occupied. They were based on how much they could sell for at the time, right? And that's a classification that happened in the middle of the 19th century, which is still extremely current now, and to some extent, which actually guides the places like the Livex or your blue chip investments. If for example, in Saint-Émilion, if you've heard of, the Premier Grand Cru Classé, which is this classification that sort of gets revamped every 10 years, think Chateau, Cheval Blanc and Ozone and so on. Part of the decision-making process is based on how famous that property is. So about 35% of the allocation of the allocated points relies on their famousness sort of rating, so how highly they rank on Google, do they have a website in different languages? And you start looking in detail at this industry that we've created, and it's so sophisticated. It's just full of hot air, and that, as the consumer is getting more and more savvy, that is beginning to sort of crumble, and, look into it. It's quite fascinating. Similarly, we talk a lot about handmade. Wine is, artisanal produce, it's always touched the hand of the winemaker. But by and large, most of the production looks like this. It's just a factory environment, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying don't do this. I'm not saying we're doing something wrong by making wine like this. But we've sold the illusion that it's all handmade, farm-to-table type scenario. But of course it's not, because that wouldn't be sustainable. And the majority of the industry is like this, but that's not what we've been selling as an illusion. This is another sort of illusion that we've been very good at creating. You can buy literally off the internet a number of additives. I mean, yeast only came about in the 1970s, so this is quite a recent process that we've been going through in the wine industry. But we've created homogenization. We've created wines that are actually made using the same additives all over the world, using the same technique, using the same recipe. And this globalization of taste means that actually the wine industry is, I think, become quite boring. And I wanted to read you a. This is just from that website. So this is talking about a yeast, right? And when I read you this, think, have I not read this tasting notes somewhere along the way on a website? Or so when properly fed, CY3079 has good alcohol tolerance up to 15% and is a low producer of VA and sulfides. It is recommended for barrel fermented Chardonnays and surly aging, right? Surly is when you keep the wines on the lees. Chardonnays produced with this yeast have rich, full mouthfeel and are characterized by aromas of fresh butter, almond, honey, white flowers, and pineapple. Right? So next time you open a newspaper or you read tasting notes, just think how much of that is actually coming from the yeast, or how much of that is actually coming from the winemaking process, the terroir, or all of these elements, because yeast can have a big impact in shaping up your final produce. And look, all I'm saying is that this has been happening. This is how we've been selling wine, and I've been in that category. I've studied wines for years. I've bought wine en primeur, and I've invested in wine. I've clamored around. After Parker Point rated wines, I've been to Latour, to all the dinners, done vertical of Petrus, Yquem, you name it, I've done it. Because that's been my training. But it's just for me along the way, there was a moment where I realized that this industry is quite samey. All the wines I was tasting were getting very repetitively the same, until I realized that there are some wines that were really grabbing my attention. They were really resonating with me, and I realized that there was a leitmotiv, that was sort of getting all these wines together, which was they were all natural wines, and this is how I got my sort of, apparently you called it the God cup, the something. This was my moment in wine. And this is where I really came across natural wine. And for me, the big difference was that, natural wine is made by farmers, so people with, you look at their hands and you know that they've been digging the ground, not just like this kind of highly manicured, hands, not wearing suit, but actually getting down and dirty in the vineyard. People, they were highly observant. But, for me, they were wines that were really real. So here you can talk about terroir, because here, natural wine is essentially wine made, from an organically farmed, biodynamically certified or not. I mean, that's a different question. But basically, where you have a lot of soil life, where the vine is part of the environment and able to interact with the environment and assimilate all the minerals, and then made, with very low intervention, to no additives. So it's nothing added, nothing taken away. And the beauty with wine is wine makes itself, right? We are, I know that for coffee it's very different because it has to go through a whole bunch of process. Grapes has everything. They've got water, all the minerals, the yeast, everything. It's like apple. You can actually crush juice and make wine. There's traces of wine being made purposefully sort of some 8,000 years ago. It's the Neolithic period. People didn't have all sorts of additives. This is just how it was made. And it's just, we wanted to control it more and more. We wanted to shape it. We want to just make wine which is like the same bottle after year, year after year, year after year. Natural wine is obviously different, but wine makes itself. I mean, this is a guy who I took the photo. This is in Georgia, in Imereti. I was doing a film there, and he's a potter, so he makes amphora, and he has two of these big, they're called quevries on the ground outside, and that's it. That's all you need to make wine. So this idea that you need all these big, sophisticated equipment is again one of these big illusions that we've built around wine. You're gonna taste two wines, blind. I'm not going to tell you what they are, and then I'll take you through the wine. So for me, natural wine is all about aliveness, right? And I wanted to prove, it's very difficult to, obviously, prove life when you kind of taste the wines and so on, but for me, it's about making natural wine is preserving the life from the vineyard all the way through to the glass, and to have something which actually is live. What I did is I gave 2 bottles of Sancerre, so these are the same, what you've tasted, same grape variety, same region, 2 Sauvignon Blanc, and I gave it to friends of mine who work at Imperial, and they just put the 2 wines under a microscope, took photos of the wines, and then tried to cultivate bacteria and so on. The image on your left is sterile filtered Sauvignon Blanc from Sancerre, where there's literally, it's as sterile, probably even more sterile than water would be. Okay, so there's just nothing sort of left in that glass. The second is a Sancerre made by Sébastien Riffaut, completely sulfite-free, works horse-ploughed vineyards, everything is done biodynamically, and no fining, no filtering at all. And obviously, these are mostly dead yeast cells. There's a bit of live yeast in there, but mostly it's just residues from the fermentation and some bacteria. So actually, they were able to pick out some bacteria and grow them. Okay, so proving indeed there was life in that glass. And as a result, the wine, the natural wines are a fresh produce. Earlier in the presentation, people were talking about the research about the freshness, and I think here too with wine we need to stop thinking of wine as a dead produce on a shelf of a supermarket and actually relate to it as maybe more of a fresh produce that needs a bit more care and that can evolve and maybe doesn't have the same consistency. So in your glass you had the first one you're tasting. I think you can probably guess which is which, but you had a Sancerre, so a Sauvignon Blanc from the monopolette from here, and another one James had to get it from a specialist restaurant. But the first one is like I would call it a box standard Sancerre. Added yeast and the whole gamut there, block malolactic fermentation, sterile filtered, blah, 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 very unripe grapes, basically, versus a wine which is 2011 from Sébastien Riffaut, 3 years aging in a barrel, nothing added, nothing taken away, a wine which is a lot more pronounced aromatically, a wine which has a very, very different taste profile. So now I'm not saying, in fact, maybe we could do a show of hand and see who preferred the first one. Okay, about half, and then who preferred the second one? Okay, and who hasn't voted? Why?
Voting for both.
Too much of a difference? Okay, you like them both?
Yeah, well, I drink the first one on a hot day by the pool. I drink the second one with dinner.
So you never stop drinking.
There you go. You've one life to live, right?
Okay. And I think that's interesting because, the thing with natural wine is that, and that's been our biggest hurdle, really, is that with the wine trade and consumers has been to deal with expectation. We have literally brainwashed our consumer into thinking that a Sauvignon Blanc should be tasting like this. And people expect a Sauvignon Blanc to taste like this. So, the first wine that you tasted is your archetypical, classic, textbook Sauvignon Blanc made according to a certain recipe, which is added yeast, block mallow, early harvesting to preserve all these kind of capsicum sort of flavors, probably, yeast that enhances certain aromas and blah, 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 and blah, 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 and so on. And this is what people, when you give them a Sauvignon Blanc, this is what they expect. This is what they want. And I'm saying, well, there's another face to Sauvignon Blanc, and we need to be able to embrace it as well. But that's been really challenging, particularly with the wine trade, because people have this idea, this is what a Sauvignon Blanc should taste like. But this is what a Sauvignon Blanc should taste like based on a 40-year-old recipe, yet we've been making wine for 8,000 years. So how is this a typical Sauvignon Blanc? But we've gotten down the route of this tunnel, which is quite dangerous, because then what you do is you alienate all the other styles, because you're saying, this is a Syrah from this region, this is a typical Syrah from this region. Anything else which doesn't really taste like that shouldn't be called a Syrah from the Rhone, for example, right? And that's something to be wary of, because you need to realize that what you do is you create these expectations, and my job is really to uneducate people. We are an overly educated industry where people fancy themselves as wine experts because they know about this soil type in Chablis and so on, so they think this is what a Chablis should taste like. And I'm saying, yeah, but really, you should be able to enjoy a glass of wine, which is a great glass of wine, without having to know it's a Chablis. So it's about getting out of your head and bringing it back down to your senses. I'll give you a very quick example. I'm working on a really exciting project in the Caribbean where we're implementing a natural wine list. In fact, we've planted some coffee beans there as well. So it's a 400-acre farm, pretty high-end, and I'm curating the wine list and I'm training the staff. They're all from the island, all Kittian. they've never opened a bottle of wine before. And I'm having to train them into like that Sancerre you had without them even knowing what a Sauvignon Blanc is, even them knowing what a Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Limestone might be, all through just taste it and tell me what you think. And you would be amazed as to the amount of how people can actually taste quality without any cultural references. And this is what we need to focus on with wine, and I don't know about other industries, but we are overeducated and we lose the ability to actually trust ourselves. So we put a lot of influences on wine critics, journalists, because we're lost, because we feel like we can't taste and appreciate quality. So it's just something to bear in mind, and this is something which has happened a lot in my industry, and I really, for me, it's about uneducating, and then just trust your gut instinct. And then once people get into it, when I first sort of went, the natural wine way years ago, people thought I was like completely insane, because I became an MW. I could like actually have some quite prestigious, well-paid work, but I thought I just want to be with people who are like me. I was brought up on a farm, and this is who I want to work with. And things are really changing, and once people get into the whole natural wine thing, once people really embrace authenticity of flavor, diversity of flavor, the freshness, the aliveness. I created this fair 4 years ago. That was a little interesting fair. To now, this year we had thousands of people coming from all over the world. Entire restaurants like Nomas and their staff. People are really getting into it. But it's really important. I never kind of deviated. I always stuck to what I feel is really important. And actually, things are changing, and people are really getting into this sort of natural wine, authenticity of taste, integrity, transparency, and so on. So this is the last slide. Look, I think what's really important from us is, we have built this very fancy, beautiful, premium industry, which is all about like how much money you have, because how much wine you can afford, can you have the right glasses, can you travel to the wine regions. We really have built this fancy house of cards, but it is a house of cards because it's beginning to crumble a little bit. Because we in the wine industry, very much like with any food industry, people now want authenticity. People are asking the right questions. It's a tremendously exciting time, like in London, and as I know, wherever you're coming from, we're seeing so much more of the, that maker's generation, people making authentic breads and pushing craft beers. The coffee scene is getting really, really, really exciting. But what I've noticed is what's really important is, you can never lose focus. This is Eddie, who's from the Gothenburg, from Austria, who's a friend of mine. He's a grower. You can never lose focus on this, because at the end of the day, it's all about the grower. It's all about what the grower can do. It's all about their stories. It's very well to kind of like embellish it and add loads of like strata to make it more and more premium. But what people want to know is who's actually behind the wine. And for us, it's quite straightforward. And don't get lost in the hyper marketing, because this is what we've done. We've just hyper marketed our product. Don't get lost as an industry, because I see there's so many. The way people talk is exactly how we talk about wine, but don't get lost in this hyper marketing, because you could be at the beginning of also building yourself a house of cards. And anyway, it's we've done that, been there, and now it's kind of time to move on a little bit. But there we go. Thank you.